So here in the essay is where things get a little complicated and technical things, more technical things we need to keep in mind. And maybe a little frustrating too, because what they immediately do then in their quest to provide a better response to the asymmetry problem than Nagel provided, they take some time to present this rather complicated scenario from another philosopher named Derek Parfit, which then they immediately dismiss as being inadequate to address the asymmetry problem. So one may wonder why they're sort of goofing around then and running in circles, but they're not really, because although they do say that Parfit's hypothetical can't really be applied to experience or the problem of death, Parfit introduces a very valuable thing into the discussion, and that is time. The way that temporal relations and temporal facts are crucial sometimes in terms of deciding for us the value of certain things, the good and bad of things. That is, the relation that one stands in temporally to those things, whether they're in the past, the future, or the present, will to a large degree determine how much we value them or how much we disvalue them, how much we fear them. And that is a very important thing to keep in mind. And with that introduced, they are then able to provide their amended scenarios that they actually do think solve the asymmetry problem. But so the Parfit thing is not just goofing around. There is a very important reason for introducing that. So what is the Parfit example, and how is it related to the asymmetry problem? They say on page 215, recently Derek Parfit has suggested another response to the asymmetry problem. His position could be put as follows: we have a not irrational bias toward the future to the extent that there are cases where we are indifferent toward or care substantially less about our own past suffering, but not indifferent toward our own future suffering. The notion that human beings are biased toward the future would mean that it's rational sometimes to care more about things that happen, that are prospective, that are to happen in the future, than things that are retrospective, things that have happened in the past. So then they say, so it might be true that it isn't irrational to have asymmetric attitudes toward our own past and future non-existence. That would be solving the asymmetry problem to their satisfaction. So what is the Parfit example? Well, you remember, it's he's imagines himself waking up in a hospital and not knowing his immediate past, but knowing that he's been scheduled for this operation, which he'll have to be conscious for, which will be very painful, but he won't remember afterwards. So he wakes up and he's not sure whether he's had this operation or whether he will have. So he asks the nurse, and she says, she can tell me only that the following is true. I may be the patient who had his operation yesterday. In that case, my operation was the longest ever performed, lasting 10 hours. I may instead be the patient who is to have a short operation later today. It is either true that I did suffer for 10 hours or true that I shall suffer for 1 hour. So then the nurse goes out to find out which of these things is true of him. And he says, while she is away, it is clear to me which I prefer to be true. If I learn that the first is true, that is, that I had the incredibly painful 10-hour operation yesterday, I shall be greatly relieved. That is, that one then would prefer to have had even 10 times more suffering in the past than to be looking forward to 1 hour. So top page 216, authors say here, Parfit's claim is that it seems to be a deep-seated feature of us that we regard our own past and future sufferings asymmetrically. So that he doesn't explicitly defend the rationality of this sort of asymmetry, but he has pointed to a class of examples involving bads other than death, in which it doesn't appear obviously unreasonable to hold asymmetric attitudes. So it's promising that if it's rational to hold asymmetric attitudes towards these sort of sufferings, maybe it's rational to hold asymmetric attitudes towards prenatal and posthumous non-existence. But no, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Epicurean problem is that we're talking about things that we, with regard both to prenatal and posthumous non-existence, we're talking about bads that we will never actually suffer, that we will never actually experience directly. So they continue in 216, let us grant, for the sake of argument, that Parfit is correct about his example. The problem is that it cannot be extended to the case of death. The reason is that Parfit's case involves a bad for a person which is experienced as bad by the person. That is, the actual physical suffering of the operation. One's own pain is perhaps paradigmatic of such bad, but death is not a bad of this kind. That is bringing back the basic Epicurean point. Indeed, the entire problem of justifying our intuitive asymmetric attitudes arises precisely because death is a bad for a person which is not experienced as bad by the person. Further, it seems that it is plausible to suppose that Parfit's conclusion will only apply to cases involving bads experienced as bad by the person. Why? That is, why will his scenario only apply to bads that are actually experienced as bad, like physical suffering? That's because of what they're going to go on and say. Cases which are structurally similar to Parfit's, except involving bads not experienced as bad by the person, yield symmetric attitudes. And what they go on to try to establish through their own hypotheticals, and actually use of Parfit's, is that unlike the kind of bads like physical suffering that we experience directly, which we do regard asymmetrically depending upon whether they're in the past, have experienced them, or in the future will experience them. When it comes to bads that are not directly experienced by the person, and this would include both the bads that happen to other people and the bads, presumably, that happened to me before birth and will happen after death. And when it comes to those sort of things, as it turns out, the conditions of rationality, in terms of how we regard them, are symmetric. That is, we don't make any big distinctions when it comes to these bads about them that are based upon whether they are in the past or in the future. And they're relying again on Parfit, another hypothetical that he comes up with on page 217. The one having to do with exile and well, the mother's suffering. Parfit says, I am an exile from some country where I have left my widowed mother. Though I am deeply concerned about her, I very seldom get news. I have known for some time that she is fatally ill and cannot live long. I am now told something new. My mother's illness has become very painful in a way that drugs cannot relieve. For the next few months before she dies, she faces a terrible ordeal. That she will soon die, I already knew, but I am deeply distressed to learn of the suffering that she must endure. So now he looks forward to his mother dying, but his mother experiencing in the future some months of terrible suffering before she dies. A day later, I am told that I had been partly misinformed. The facts were right, but not the timing. My mother did have many months of suffering, but she is now dead. So what difference does that make? Before, you thought that your mother would have all this terrible suffering in the future. Now you've been informed that she's already had it in the past. Now, if things worked, the conditions of rationality, one might say here, were the same as with regard to one's own suffering, one should be relieved. Just as we would be relieved, we were relieved when we were that confused hospital patient to find out that our sufferings were in the past rather than the future. But that's not the way it works when we are thinking about other people's suffering, is it? The authors continue on 217. Parfit claims about this example that the new piece of information that my mother's suffering is in the past should not have a crucial impact on my attitude. Concerning the suffering of others, it is rational to have temporally symmetric attitudes. And then they go on to say that, well, the way that we feel about the sufferings of others is a special case of the way we feel about bads in general that are not experienced by us. We do not experience other people's sufferings, and therefore we regard them symmetrically. That is, we don't feel any better if they're in the past than if they're in the future. We regard them as equally bad. This is true, they say, of all bads that are not directly experienced by the person. So they continue on page 217, the difference between our symmetric attitudes toward another's past and future suffering and our asymmetric attitudes towards our own past and future suffering is a special case of the difference between our attitudes toward bads not experienced by us and bads experienced by us. If this is correct, it is appropriate to have temporally symmetric attitudes toward the class of regrettable things experienced by others, even if it is appropriate to have temporally symmetric attitudes towards a class of regrettable things experienced by us. Thus, Parfit's own example highlights the inadequacy of the present response to the challenge posed by Epicurus and Lucretius. It's the asymmetry problem. So things have been established in terms of how we're going to regard this matter. We have to take into account time and the way that our temporal relations to bads and goods influences the way we think about them and the importance they have for them, and whether we regard bads as equal or unequal, whether we treat them symmetrically or asymmetrically. To a large degree, it depends upon whether they're in the past or the future. But that Parfit's hypotheticals fail to solve the asymmetry problem because they only apply to experiences that we directly have, that they only apply to bads that are directly experienced by us. And death, because of the Epicurean stricture, is not such a bad. So they're going to have to twist it, they're going to have to change it a little bit, using that basic framework, but changing it enough so that they provide, in their mind, an actual solution to the asymmetry problem.